A day of somber reflection across Canada and here at home as the country marks the very first Truth and Reconciliation Day. A mother and her month-old baby narrowly escape injury after being hit by a speeding truck that went on to collide with another car, killing the woman inside. And COVID outbreaks at 2 Hamilton schools weren't really outbreaks at all. We learned that flawed testing produced false positive results.
CHCH Evening News with Phil Perkins and Taz Boga.
Good evening. Ceremonies continue to be held this hour as people across the country mark the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation.
It's a day to commemorate the history and ongoing impacts of residential schools where Indigenous children were torn from their families and abused. Indigenous speakers at a ceremony in St. Catharines this morning shared the impact of residential schools that they've had on their families and the feeling of having to assimilate to survive. Kelly Botello brings us that story.
A song for the children who never came home. Many Canadians have only just begun to understand the extent of the horrors that occurred in residential schools. But Indigenous people have carried the dark truth all along.
My grandfather was a survivor of the residential school system. As a child, he dug graves at the residential school to bury other children.
Robin Bourgeois is a survivor, just like all the Indigenous people at St. Catharines City Hall today and across Canada.
We survived the thing that was meant to kill the Indian, and we're here. We're standing here right now.
Fallon Farinacci's parents were killed by her mother's stalker when she was 9 years old. The Red River Métis woman says because of her trauma, she was pushed away from her indigeneity.
I was, as I said, the government's dream come true, being assimilated and not knowing and not having that connection to culture and land, and so I call it, for myself, identity trauma.
Many here today say they lived a big portion of their lives believing that their Indigenous heritage was a problem.
We've lost a sense of pride in being Indigenous. For a really long time, I was told the best thing I could do was not be Indigenous.
Patricia Garson had to leave her community to attend high school in Winnipeg. It was during that time she realized many Indigenous women trying to get back to their communities never made it home.
A lot of students that I knew hitchhike home. And then from today with Facebook and all that, I tried searching for them. They never made it home.
Many Indigenous people here today say they hope this day becomes an opportunity for Canadians to learn.
It's about sharing that awareness. It's about listening to the stories of the Indigenous people.
Bourgeois says she still thinks about her grandfather digging those graves.
What that must have been like as a little kid, digging graves, knowing full well that you could end up in one of them.
Kelly Botello, CHCH News.
The chief of the Kamloops BC First Nation, that was the first to discover the remains of missing children, says true reconciliation requires truth. Chief Roseanne Casimiro calls for the disclosure of all relevant records and documents from the church and government to help identify missing Indigenous children at former residential school sites, including those in unmarked graves. Casimiro says they want a meaningful apology from the Pope for the trauma to Indigenous children and intergenerational suffering.
Our community continues to navigate the complexities of the impacts following the horrific findings of the Liskway, the missing. We also knew that it was just the start of the story and that other residential schools would likely have similar findings, and they have. Reconciliation requires truth. It requires truth and is but one milestone along with the restitution and potentially retribution in a path towards reconciliation. At the very least, steps towards reconciliation demands honesty and transparency.
This is a day to reflect on the atrocities that Canada has committed against First Nations people and Indigenous people of Turtle Island. I've always said that truth must come before reconciliation. True reconciliation is about learning, sharing, and growing as a country.
An event was also held at Hamilton's McMaster University today. Many gathered to commemorate Orange Shirt Day and the children who never made it home and those who survived. Many from the community shared their stories while acknowledging much more still needs to be done.
This new era is about healing and more awareness, all of these things. And then when I was processing some of it, I could see these little ones and their spirits coming to the light, to the orange light. They're free. We're feeding their spirit when we do the feast, when we're singing, when we're talking to them. But the rest that are still not found, they want to come too. They want to come too. And I said, it's okay, it's okay. We'll find you. I promise we'll find you. And you can be set free too. But right now we're going to put the orange light around you. And the guardians that are with you will help you, and so that you'll feel safe and not scared, and it calmed them.
The event involved the university's Indigenous Studies Program, Indigenous Research Institute, Indigenous Student Services, and Indigenous Health Learning Lodge. McMaster says it's important to expand and increase opportunities for students to engage with Indigenous language, culture, and history. A memorial walk took place at Spencer Smith Park today in Burlington. Dozens of people, many wearing orange shirts, took part in the event organized by the urban Indigenous peoples of Burlington. There were education vendors as well as arts, dancers, and spiritual healers.
And there's hope today that will build on the momentum of the grassroots-led Orange Shirt Today. We head to Ohsweken now, where people are gathering to remember victims and survivors. Emily Taylor joins us live. Emily.
That's right, Taz. Just behind me here, a few dozen people have gathered here at Chiefswood Park. They're mostly in orange shirts, and they're placing candles and traditional medicine around a large orange center here in the middle of the field in order to honor survivors and victims of those in residential schools on this first nationally recognized day of truth and reconciliation. Earlier today, a group also gathered in Kanata Village, which is part of the Grand River Mohawk Territory, for an event called the Eighth Fire, featuring traditional Iroquoian dances, songs, and food. People attending the event say National Day for Truth and Reconciliation is both a day for honoring those lost in residential schools and their survivors, and to celebrate the community's resilience. Event organizers are also looking for Ontario Premier Doug Ford to make the day a provincial holiday after hundreds of unmarked graves were found on sites of former residential schools across the country this summer.
We have a huge catchment of Indigenous people that are just trying to make ends meet, working, that may not have been offered the day off to be able to be with their family on today.
It's been really hard since the first 215 were found in Kamloops. So since then, we've been talking to our kids, my husband and I, we've been talking to our kids about what this means and where we come from. My grandmother, she was a survivor of the mush hole over here in Brantford, as was my uncle.
The Woodland Cultural Center, where former residential schools located in Brantford, didn't host any formal events today, but a small crowd gathered outside the steps where hundreds of stuffed toys and children's shoes have been placed. Among the crowd was school survivor Carol Chadwick and her sister Janet. Both attended the school as small girls in the 1930s, as well as some of their siblings. They visit the school every year on Orange Shirt Day. More people are starting to gather here at Chiefswood Park, and in a matter of minutes, we're expecting to hear from residential school survivors, as well as elected Chief Mark Hill. Back to you inside, Taz.
Live. Premier Doug Ford was at Toronto's Massey College today, where Chief R. Stacey Laforme of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation spoke at a Toronto ceremony marking the day honoring Indigenous survivors and children.
I just want to say that the pain and hurt and the grief of these losses has been strong, and I am so hopeful because people understand that this is not just the loss, only the loss of Indigenous children. This is the loss of our children, of this country, and we have to make it right somehow, and we will.
For generations, Indigenous people have endured the harsh realities and impacts of residential schools. Ontarians need to face this dark chapter of our history and commit to taking action.
Canada's first Indigenous Governor-General released a recorded message on Canada's first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. Here's a short part of it.
I am speaking to you from Rideau Hall on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I am honored to be Canada's Governor-General and to be part of acknowledging this very first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. As we strive to resolve the tensions of the past with the promise of the future, we can stand together and move forward with grace and humility.
In a statement released yesterday, Mary Simon said as the daughter of a white father and Inuk mother, she was not made to attend a residential school. Instead, she says she was homeschooled while other children were ripped out of their homes, sent to residential schools, and not allowed to speak their language or honor their culture.
And on this first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, we acknowledge that here at CHCH on Innovation Drive reside upon the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit.
And as part of the city of Hamilton, we are also situated among the traditional territories of the Neutral and Haudenosaunee on land which is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people.
Now we thank the Mississaugas of the Credit and our First Nations neighbors for sharing this land with us, and we commit ourselves to listening, learning, celebrating, and developing respectful and meaningful relationships with one another.